So I'd like to welcome everybody to our second seminar as a part of our Public Pedagogies Institute seminar series, Public Pedagogies of Location. Before I give a more fulsome introduction to Belinda or Bindi, who's going to be presenting today, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of country. I wish to pay my deep respect to the ancestors, elders, communities and families of the Boonwurrung and the Warrawong on whose lands I am on today. So welcome everyone, a particular warm welcome to people if this is your first session with us. I think everybody who was here last week would agree that it was just fantastic. It was actually a very moving experience in terms of the ideas that people, the presentations itself, but also the ideas that people who are engaged in the presentations generated. I just loved it. Every now and again, when you do organise something like this, you're often so nervous about how it's all going to work, particularly as it's technologically mediated. But I have had a few moments where I've just sort of stopped and thought, do you know what, we're actually doing something that's pretty awesome. So yeah, I feel really thrilled about it. So today we have Belinda MacGill, who's a long-standing member and contributor to the Public Pedagogies Institute. You can find the article that was set for today's seminar in the Journal of Public Pedagogies. I'd encourage everyone to have a look at the journal. It is a great journal. The session today is titled Let Art Teach, Visual Considerations and Contemplations. And I'm going to hand it over both to Bindi, but also Bronwyn, who's going to be the chair for today's session. I hope you all enjoy it.
Straight over to Bindi.
I'd also like to acknowledge the land. I'm in Adelaide, South Australia, so I acknowledge this land that I meet on today as the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and that I respect their spiritual relationship with their country. I also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today, and also pay respects to the cultural authority of Aboriginal people visiting or attending from other areas of South Australia or Australia, and that Kaurna people never ceded sovereignty. And I'll be looking at some of those ideas today. Art, photography and the image offers opportunities for a pedagogical encounter with the world, and Gert Biester's theories of world-centred education sits comfortably within a public pedagogy, but raises questions about how knowledge is produced and to what effect. So his book, if you've ever had a chance to read it, is called Letting Art Teach. And he argued for education as an encounter between subjects, culminating in a turn towards the world. So it's kind of a shift towards this very Western Anglo world-centered singular perspective to a world-centered relational perspective. In what ways does the image without text or performance turn us towards an idea? So questioning the image within public spaces and how representational fields operates as a circuit of culture will be discussed or explored in this paper. The culture is about shared meanings, and we use language to produce new knowledge. But what about visual texts as a production of knowledge that advance alternate meanings for a post-human world or its opposite? So I'll be drawing on these themes throughout this presentation. And this session sort of employs embodied-based strategies and dialogic meaning making. So I'll be doing a bit of talking, but we'll also be doing a lot of interactive work through the text-mediated space. So we'll kind of be exploring some of those ideas around the circuit of images and how they operate. So I'm just going to move on to my website and show you the Public Pedagogies website that I was referring to. Some of you may have read this paper, but it's basically on this website called Enviroaesthetics. And the reason why I chose this as a platform was because it was the original intention of what was happening at the time when the conference was proposed, and we'd nearly lost our house about 3 or 4 times on Kangaroo Island, and there was just lots of remains left. We basically had to evacuate 3 or 4 times. So sort of talking about this idea of, you know, being gifted by the environment through just walking in space. And I think that really goes back to what Bronwyn's session was and her groups was last week. And then that kind of linked also to the Public Pedagogies site here, where I also was looking at this idea of curatorial situations where we go into environments. So for example, we go into museums and we're trained to see things in particular ways. And in particular, Aboriginal knowledges and Aboriginal art and texts have historically been located in museums instead of art galleries. And in a sense, that curation is a form of a contact zone. And in this paper, I talk about the contact zone as a site, as a mediating site. So with that in mind, and sort of been exploring these ideas around contact zones and museums and the ways in which it produces knowledge through the construction of location, space, artefacts hidden behind glass, in dim lit rooms. In Adelaide's the archetypal place in the Museum of South Australia. They have all of the Aboriginal Ghana and Ngarrindjeri sections in a very dimly lit room, all under glass, everything written in the past tense. So what happens when people come through it in this public space? It reproduces this idea of past history erased and darkened, and you know, there's these mug shots almost of ancestors on the wall. It's quite a shocking example of the ways in which the colonies and the colonizers produce knowledge through representation. So what's sitting behind this idea was how museums on one hand produces knowledge through this contact zone, and then you go into somewhere like the Geelong Powerhouse, and how this semi-curated space offered an alternative kind of educational experience through an embodied learning encounter. So there was this, you know, site that I could move around and choose images that I could select to photograph kind of freely. And so I looked at this idea of the public pedagogy of Instagram that happened when I was there. So there was a lot of people taking photos and taking pictures and then putting them on Instagram. And I thought, well, this is an opportunity for, you know, this idea of a public pedagogy. But then I went to Urban Monk's image down on the bottom here. I don't know if you can see, it says, sorry, 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 obviously referring to Kevin Rudd's sorry speech. And then in the back, there are 3 paste-ups of Aboriginal children that were part of the stolen generation. So there was this quite incredible narrative emerging out of this space that meant that there were people taking photos of this, putting it on Instagram, and it was circulating around. So I considered this in this paper about the complexity of that, and thinking about this idea as, you know, the democratization as a result of broadband. And what's happening is there's another circulation of culture. So if you think of Reco Rene's, Black Douglas, Urban Monk and Adnate's work, it's shared with a global audience within a democratic cyber field. So these work offers opportunities to scale up meaningful micro-public encounters to a new notion of citizenship which respects difference. Learning experiences scaffold an emergent visual and digital text that inform a literacy that offers hope for intercultural understandings of Indigenous political narratives. Whilst running the risk of romanticisation, Instagram offers a new tonality that may reflect an emergent but uncharted post-colonial receptivity within the genre of street art. So in a way, it's the post-colonial turn where Instagram and the cyberfield is actually operating on a new democratic space. That means that new knowledge is being produced in a different way. It's no longer sitting within a binary frame. So,
Sorry, Bindi, can I just, sorry to interrupt you. There's just a question that's come up, which I think would be useful if you can help. Just for our North American guests, could you briefly explain what you mean by the sorry speech and the stolen generation?
Okay. So, Kevin Rudd, previous Prime Minister, was the first Prime Minister to declare the word sorry and similarly in America and North America, where children were taken either from reserves or put in specific schooling systems that meant that they were being trained to be servants of the state or servants for and farmers for as a new workforce. For over 100 years, I think it was 3 in 10 children were taken, and it continues today. The sorry speech by Kevin Rudd, I think 2008, was to declare that that policy that came out of the White Australia policy and prior and previous policies on assimilation had such a huge impact that there's intergenerational trauma as a result of this policy. So he was the first government to actually acknowledge that this happened, that it was a state-based decision that produced the policies to take children away from Aboriginal families. And when he gave that speech, he gave it directly to Aboriginal people who were stolen, or part of the stolen generation, as it was then later called, and the impact it had on those families. And he took responsibility in that sense. But on the other hand, whilst that is significant, and I was actually speaking to a friend last night who was part of the stolen generation, and he said that speech meant everything to me. So the speech itself was significant. But on the other hand, when the state, the government continued to use policy against the Aboriginal people, such as the Northern Territory intervention, then that becomes a problematic issue. So when Urban Monk does a repetition of the words sorry, 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 he's referring kind of directly to both the sorry speech, but also the repetition of the word in order to highlight the fact that whilst he may have said sorry, there still needs to be some shift in policy to actually represent the words that he said in policy. So I think that he calls it, Urban Monk calls it, sorry, play that card again. So it's a significant moment in Australian history about acknowledging state involvement in the control and management of Aboriginal people. Prior to that, it had been basically whitewashed. And I know similarly in America, you've got the same sort of situation historically. So I hope that kind of addresses that question. Now I wanted to go on to something experimental, which is always dangerous, but it's called Graffiti Wall. And in Graffiti Wall, it's the idea that we'll go into breakout rooms to talk about more specifically the idea of public pedagogy and what it means to you. So I'm hoping you can get into the EnviroAesthetic website. So we're going to put that in the chat room, and you copy and paste this link, and I'll put that in the chat room now. And one person post your collective graffiti wall. So the idea is we're going to get into groups, hopefully less than 10. We're going to talk about the idea of public pedagogy and what it means to you. And as you can see on this Padlet that I'm showing you right now, which is underneath the website I was just showing you before, we've posted a few symbols. The idea is that you press on this pink button and you will put your image. You can either draw, you can draw, for example, or you can write something, or you can take a photo. You can put anything in there. You can even put a voice recording. So basically the job is in your group, you write or talk about public pedagogy, what it means to you, tell a few stories, come up with one symbol. We've got a few examples of symbols up there, and we've also got some words, doesn't matter whatever it is. Then we come back and I re-upload the EnviroSetic thing, and we go back to Padlet. We deconstruct everyone's point of view. So as each group, we'll have a look at what each group wrote, represented, and have a conversation as a collective around that. And then in 15 minutes, we'll come back and talk about it. Okay, so I'll kick off with our group. We started talking about this idea of mutuality, construct of space, collaborate and orchestrate and co-construct. And in the middle of that was the word affect. So that's not exactly the diagram that we completed, but it's a beginning of the diagram. If we could then maybe go to the next diagram, which is this one here. I know it's a start. Who did that one?
We were talking about all-encompassing and widespread and learning communities and like learning to draw without a mouse here, the Venn diagram.
Ah, okay, yeah. And could you say more about the Venn diagram and how that fits together?
I don't know if you can see that. That was my little tiny attempt there. In terms of answering the question of what does public pedagogy mean to you, one of the things I mentioned was, for me, educational approaches and systems and cultures that start with a human being and people built in, versus a tendency to talk about processes and structures and systems in a lot of educational contexts, which academic discourse, I guess, of education. And what attracts me is that there's a tendency, the way in which in public pedagogies students and learning and people are built into as a starting point, not as an afterthought. So it was an attempt at a sort of a Venn diagram with an in and out and a coming together of processes, systems, but with starting from with people built in. And I did mention that in working with Karen in the past, that's that for me personally, Karen's default position of already having the students built in is compelling.
Yeah, totally. Example of.
Yeah.
Of it. Yeah, that's really interesting. Can we now go to this one over here? Who did that one?
Sure. That was, I just made that really quick for our group. We ran out of time, so this is not approved by the group.
Well,
throw it out there.
Created.
I took notes on what everyone said and kind of bring it all together. A big theme from our conversation was how it's informal in that it exists outside of like formal institutions, but it's still affecting the individual who has to be active, not a passive learner, but active in engaging with it. And then it's also oftentimes trying to disrupt the normal of a community or of an institution. So the little nested circles are kind of the individual with the community, with the institutions, and the little spikies coming in and out are kind of the public pedagogies going across and engaging with individuals, communities to disrupt the normal and allow people to be active in that engagement.
Like the disrupt the normal and be active in that is really powerful. What about the arms up? This one here.
that was our group. And those two images we put kind of together, we also were kind of in the middle of choosing and then ran out. So I just put both. But we were talking about how we feel like it has a lot to do with togetherness and how that also could be incidental togetherness. And we talked about how there was a great analogy thinking about the weather at first, but we kind of wanted to tie more images in. So we have the hands reaching was the first image of that togetherness, and then trying to put the weather in the background. But they said the weather is kind of like public pedagogy because sometimes we are noticing when it's happening and we're talking about it when it's happening, and sometimes it's just happening and we maybe aren't conscious of it. And then there was a story about the swimming pools opening up, outdoor swimming pools in Australia opening up, and how there are like these strict guidelines of staying. So thinking about like that togetherness yet being apart, and we're trying to put a lot of things together right at the end. So I'm sorry if that seems scattered.
No, that works because it's that connectedness that you're drawing on as well. Brilliant. And what about this one here?
We didn't get to the point of summary. So these are the notes that we took during the discussion. I'll just speak for myself. I liked the comment about a way of noticing. I was thinking about pedagogy as a kind of relationship about noticing. Does anyone else want to follow that up?
Yeah, I think the importance was that learning comes from the senses, and that noticing, encompassing all the senses as you're sort of being in place, wherever that place is. And I think we also Terry talked about Indigenous ways of knowing and the importance of place as a starting point for creating knowledge. So in some ways, we see the two sort of connected.
Nice.
I think too about it being non-hierarchical, linked into the Indigenous ways as well, and community-based ways of knowing.
Excellent. Okay, there's a few more over here. I like this one. Who did that?
That was me. I'm in Meg. I was in Tao's group, so it was kind of the same Venn diagram.
Part of that. Oh, it's an extension of that.
But I guess it was about including the inside, the outside, the different. And then we started talking about different kinds of knowledges and just. That kind of, it's a very fluid diagram there, you can see. Yeah.
Are there any more that aren't there that want to share? Or have more to say? That I kind of whipped through ours, but I know that we had quite an in-depth conversation, and I got a lot out of that around the ways in which we kind of centered affect in the middle of all of that. I'm not sure if anyone else wants to add any more before I move on.
You could explain more about vibrancy in education?
Yeah.
Could they explain more about that? I think that was Meg.
I don't remember saying that, sorry.
That's exactly what Kevin was saying before, that he doesn't sometimes remember what he'd said once because it's the context and the time, and it has a vibrancy. So we were kind of talking about that in a different way in our own group, which is really interesting that, it comes out of your mouth and someone says, could you repeat that? You go, no, I can't. Does it just happen at that moment because of the synchronicity of everyone being in that moment in time in that space?
Well, it was underneath the Venn diagram there. It said vibrancy of education or something like that. If you
that wasn't.
That was our group, actually.
Oh,
Robin.
okay.
Robin took notes and Kelsey. So do you remember who said that?
I think it was me.
Yeah.
I think it was when we were talking about because public pedagogy is doing and valuing learning that can happen everywhere by everyone. There's a spontaneity and a vibrancy in that is important because it's often lacking in formal education institutions. Because we talked a bit about specifically art and public art as a public pedagogy. So people said things like, on one hand, like art, street art, for example, can be kind of I don't know, the word gentle wasn't used, but like an experience that is dependent on being receptive. The street art is not being aggressive, it's just there and dependent on the viewer being receptive to that. And then other times it can be, an example was given about the woman who did an exhibition about sexual abuse with a map that showed where women were sexually abused in locations. I think, Jenny, this was one of your bits of your teaching, possibly. So there's that sense that it can be also less gentle, allow us to talk about hard topics by being quite specific in the way it directs your attention.
Yeah,
that's the best I can do.
Which kind of relates to that BS, to how do you turn towards it idea as well. Okay, I think, would anyone else like to finalise any comments? I think one thing that came out for us was the privilege of spaces that we may not have tapped on in our group. There was mention about, we were talking about this idea of people don't always feel comfortable in certain spaces around that relate to privilege. But I'm not sure if there's anyone else wants to, any concluding comments, otherwise I'll move right along. So that was a creative body-based learning strategy. It actually comes out of, it's not normally done like that actually at all, but because we had to do a tech-mediated version of it, it relies on dialogue and everyone contributing to the space, so that it's not just one person, it's not feeding into the knowledge, it's a collective knowledge system. And I think Kevin also spoke about that in our group. And generally it's embodied, like generally you're moving, you're creating, you've got a long graffiti wall on the ground and you're producing that, and then you create meaning together through that collective approach. And for me, trying to work out how to do public pedagogy in a way, for me, was about creating strategies that could enable everyone to have a voice, or to contribute to the construction and production of knowledge, and we all learn together. Obviously, I don't see learning as a hierarchical thing. So if you are interested in creative body-based learning strategies, I'll leave up a website that has where there are specific strategies that you can just use and make it your own, and it's quite useful. It comes from Katie Dawson out of University of Texas, and it's under the banner of drama-based instruction, but it's been packaged in a way that you can pretty much mobilise in any space. I know I'm pushing the boundaries here with technology, but anyway, giving it a go. So I also was kind of curious about public pedagogies when they become, dangerous is the wrong word, but telling another message where, for example, Urban Monk's story or image could also be circulating without any content, circulating without any understanding. So how do we move into this idea of, a decolonising space? And we tapped on some of that in relation to this idea of a way of noticing. And so what came out of that idea of way of noticing to me was deep listening. And to me, that is also part of public pedagogy, in the sense that, how can we contribute to decolonisation in this, in the world that we're living in? It's just completely bonkers. and what pedagogical response can we use to sit relationally in the world, and how do we do that within an ethics of care? And for me, obviously looking at this idea of the circuit of images and the circuit of culture that is produced through, historically in the archives, in the Western context of the museum and categorization and management of knowledge production, and how we're doing that differently in public pedagogy. I wanted to deconstruct and then reconstruct this idea of public pedagogy in relation to decolonising the ways in which obviously race is understood, and historically it comes out of social Darwinism. It's a theory that was produced in parallel with Darwin to substantiate and use for territorial occupation to build a hierarchy of races. So it was a constructed idea. Obviously, Australia was illegally colonised, even under international law, even at that time. But Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have never ceded sovereignty. So this debate continues. So in what ways has Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people actually fully built a counter narrative to these this form of colonisation that continues through representation, let alone policy? So I'm just looking at these two images as a site or site-specific text that talk back to the state, that talks back to a public pedagogy, and is a form of public pedagogy that deconstructs the ways in which Australia was colonised. So within this context, the Australian specific context of Australia still sits within that retro assimilation, and it continues. But these two images, the Bark Petition and Urara, are part of the decolonising practices, and it looks for and provides a complete counter narrative to the ways in which the state positions itself in terms of ownership. So consider site-specific Indigenous political agency that shift the regimes of biopower through the field of art and law, such as the Bark Petition and Urara. Political projects such as the Bark Petition and Urara highlight key moments where sovereignty is reinserted back into the political landscape. These works operated as a form of public pedagogy and created material effect, and that's the key part of decolonisation as opposed to post-colonialism. So decolonisation is primarily understood, as Fitzpatrick states, a material project aimed at recuperating Indigenous political and territorial sovereignty at the same time as it seeks to alleviate material and cultural privations experienced by the colonised. The reinsertion of sovereignty by First Nations communities has been a continuous platform represented through art, petitions, letters, protests, and continues through the Uluru Statement from the Heart that was signed by Indigenous leaders, explicitly centralising that sovereignty was never ceded or extinguished. The Bark Petition on the right was used to address improper practices by the state and the mining company Nabalco towards the Yolngu people. Nabalco employees yielded a piece of paper to the Yolngu community claiming they had authority to mine bauxite. In response, leaders of the Yolngu community typed in full petition framed by designs that represents Yolngu sovereign connections to country. The petitions went to the High Court, and despite this, the mining of Yolngu land continued. Interestingly, we see the intersections of law, art, politics, and pedagogy that shifted the Australian consciousness. The Bark Petition importantly began a national outcry concerning Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land rights. In this sense, the Bark Petition pivoted around a public pedagogy where non-Indigenous peoples began to turn towards the local and specific context of the Bark Petition, and thereby it operated as an educative act that raised consciousness around land rights that culminated in the 1976 Land Rights Act. And Urara 1 on the left is a collaborative work painted on acrylic on canvas. 19 senior Aboriginal men and women at Pyrenees in the Great Sandy Desert, Western Australia, painted this in 1996. It's 80 metre square canvas was painted as the first was considered too small. So the Nurara native title application was a claim for 800,000 hectares of land that was due to be considered by the National Native Tribunal in 1997. Finally, in Colgold versus Western Australia in 2007, the Nurara won recognition of their native title rights to 76,000 square kilometres. They presented their case by designing this large painting of their land inscribed within a Nurara semiotic field. So their land is now under the custodianship of the Yunara Aboriginal Corporation, and as one of the senior artists, Peter Skipper, said, the stories and the bodies of our old people are in their country, our country. We wanted to make Katia, or white people, understand our ownership of our country. So the practice of decolonisation includes recognising the modes of engagement by which, in this context, Nurara native title applicants mobilise intimate connection to country as an expression of sovereignty that led to a material effect, with land being handed back. So this pedagogical manoeuvre was not only conducted in relation to the state, but also as a form of public pedagogy. So how do we build, or how do we know what we know? And reflecting on Urban's monk work, we can call on not only the techno-informed manoeuvres of images as a vehicle for public pedagogy, but also embodied strategies that engage with the public to consider ways of seeing and living relationally. So how do we build a public pedagogy that allows for multiple standpoints, that also make visible the structures of privilege and inequality, and at the same time call for transformation? So importantly, reflection and dialogic meaning-making strategies allow us time to reassemble ourselves in relation to others at moments in conversation and through our own creative practice. So we're going to have another go at another strategy. Good luck with that, Bindi. Anyway, so this one's called Vote with Your Feet. And I have just talked about the Bark Petition and Nurara as an enactment of public pedagogy that's been going on for a long time. But still in the Australian curriculum, for example, students are taught realism, impressionism, cubism, and they're now asked to build in the cross-curriculum priorities, for example, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges and histories. And many non-Indigenous teachers are going, I don't know how to do that. So they continue to erase that. Many continue to not include that because they don't know, they don't want to, they say, I don't want to offend anybody, and there's a sense of fear around doing that. And part of that fear comes from the fact that in their own curriculum, they weren't trained in terms of understanding various semiotic fields. So they only stick to the one that they know, in a sense. So this strategy is kind of exploring about decolonisation, Indigenous perspectives, and semiotic fields. And it's called Vote with Your Feet. And these are, I know I'm talking about big ideas here, but I'm cobbling them together through this strategy. So, for example, like I was saying, we're trained to see in particular ways. Many people are trained to see. If you come from Aboriginal communities, you're trained very early on. For example, on Anangu community, children at the age of 3 or 4 are doing perfect circles and using colours in a specific way. So they are trained to see in a particular way. So for example, for this image, there's an image on the left and an image on the right. And I'll go through the strategy now. So with this strategy, make sure you've got your fly done up and you don't have your jimmy jams on because you will be standing up or not. So Vote with Your Seat requires you to stand up if you agree with this, and I'll give you a comment. Hover if you're sort of halfway in between, or remain seated if you disagree. So you either stand up if you agree, hover if you partly agree, and remain seated if you disagree. So the first provocation is vote with your seat, so stand up if you agree, that you feel comfortable viewing both images. So that's all we have to do, either say seated or stand up. I'm going to I'm going to stand up because I feel comfortable viewing both images. Okay, so that's most of us. Okay, we'll have a quick look around. Okay, we'll sit down again. Okay, thanks everyone. That's awesome. The next provocation is vote with your seat if you feel confident describing the signs, systems, and its meanings in both images. So vote with your seat if you feel confident describing the signs, systems, and meanings in both images. Okay, we'll have a look around. There's not everyone standing up. Is anyone standing up? I don't think so. Okay. Our next job now is considered that most of us felt confident doing that initial one, that we felt confident. The second one, we didn't feel confident. So in our breakout rooms, we're going to explain to each other why we felt confident viewing both images, but not confident talking about the sign systems and meanings of both images. And I'll talk to those images after. So I'm not sure, but if we'll just talk about discussions, maybe who would like to start about their discussion, what happened for them?
In our group, I think one of the issues that came up was the issue of surrender and surrendering in this context to a discomfort.
Yeah.
And the other issue that came up was in our group there were participants from places other than Australia. And so how was it, what was their knowing that they brought to it, and how that, and also that notion of how public pedagogy works in the local, but beyond the local into the global.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there were issues that came up from those images. Well, from viewing the images, not from the images, of course, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And does anyone want to run on from that? Because I know, Caroline, we were talking about that in our group, but I'm not sure if you want to extend that.
Yeah, well, we talked, the themes that came up amongst all of us was about discomfort, and from that discomfort, a feeling of risk that you would offend or say the wrong thing. So, and you're sort of, and that would become public, I guess. So I think we talked about public pedagogies as being comfortable with the uncomfortable. And I guess it goes back to that disruption and that we talked about earlier on.
And the next group?
Yeah, our group talked about our perspectives a lot coming into it from our own identities and our own contexts. So how you interpret each image as the audience versus how you think the creator might have interpreted it as they were creating it. And kind of that dissonance there that you're not sure because you're not sure of the context. At least a lot of us weren't sure who are from America, and how there are the insider versus the outsider perspectives. So when asked to talk about the signs and the symbols and the meanings of it, if you're not on the inside of understanding the culture in which the art was created, you might not be privy to the context of that in which it was created or created for. And some questions were brought up by our group, like who am I explaining them to and where am I seeing them? In a museum, in someone's house? And those all really impact how you would speak on it, which is why a lot of us ended up staying seated because we weren't clear on those questions, which made us uncomfortable, which related to what you were just saying, Caroline.
Right. And the next group?
And sorry, there was also about effective. Sometimes the understanding or the meaning is through emotions, not words. So it's that emotional kind of response or meaning making.
Excellent. I think there was one more group, was there? Maybe not. I think that it's a really powerful way in which we've drilled down into the complex minds, into our minds in the different conceptual fields, and there's these two stories going on, and I really like the idea of, you know, the discomfort that it creates. And whilst we can talk about these images in terms of line, shape and colour, composition, we kind of can also talk about colonisation and decolonisation at the same time. So there's this powerful juxtaposing that can go on when, even in Australia, many people don't know necessarily Paddy Bedford's story or Paddy Bedford's work. So similarly, whether it's in the US or Australia, we've been, like, non-Indigenous people have been trained, and Indigenous students have been trained to read the story on the right in a particular way, and that it became normalised. So we kind of are looking at these two conceptual fields in these images, and the story of colonial occupation through the management and control of the land, represented through the protagonist in Tom Roberts' work on the right. He was an Australian Impressionist painter who is centralised as the subject. So as you can see, the guy on the horse trying to stop the sheep galloping towards the water is the protagonist, and he becomes the controller and manager of space. So spatially, you can see how he's occupying land, and you've got fences and lines that demarcate this perspective, and it's a Western perspective that puts the white male at the centre of the story of management, control and land. Whereas Paddy Bedford, he's a senior law man of the Gidja people in East Kimberley region, and he talks about another story of sovereign connection to place. He also talks about the brutal occupation of colonisers that included the Bedford Down massacre, where 11 members of his community were poisoned by strychnine and then burnt. Bedford states, "Well, this is the place where my old boss killed lots of people at one time. The killing place near the Emu Dreaming at Mount King. The wagon brought them along the road to this place." And you can see those lines across there. When they stopped here, the white man looked at them and said, "You all cut wood now, cut quickly, heap it up, and then you'll have dinner." They cut wood here, there, and all around. Then they ate poisoned food and staggered around dying. Then the fire was lit, and you can see the fire and the 11 people around the fire. The 11 individuals burnt, and the fire and the 2 women looking at Bedford Down. So the 2 women are up the top behind the mountain, looking past the track to the 11 people that died in the fire. So offering space, I think, in this context, kind of highlights 2 conversations. So we've got this feeling of discomfort, and at the same time using these images to juxtapose 2 stories about sovereignty that were very explicitly outlined with Nurara and the Bark Petition, and that this public pedagogy continues for dialogic meaning making through a visual methodology is useful to unpick specific details that are often not heard or seen. When all the senses are engaged, there is a deeper listening that can offer ways to engage stronger, or, us in a stronger understanding of our own epistemologies and ontologies. So the way we understand, the way we think about the world, I think using even a simple strategy like vote with your feet and having a conversation around it helps us to build a collective understanding around this work. So I think that it also kind of shifts the way in which Western knowledge is normally produced as well. So a critical visual methodology is useful to highlight where and how political projects have always occurred and how Indigenous people have continued to reinsert sovereignty in diverse ways. So a critical and decolonising visual methodology enables us to read images as modes of political activism at times, as demonstrations of sovereignty, and in terms of the local and specific context of the work, community, time frame, and modes of negotiation. For me, a critical decolonising pedagogy mobilises embodied strategies that examine multiples expressions of sovereignty, such as the collective works demonstrated today. It detangles national narratives and policies from counter storytelling and political activism by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So for me, this is also a moment of unlearning. So unlearning is a key element that helps us to see what we were not taught. Employing a critical visual methodology that supports reassembling standpoints that are not grounded in binaries, but instead is attuned to modes of listening to Indigenous knowledges in this case, and practices informs a critical decolonising space. But this goes to the idea of listening and deep listening. So moving on to this idea of deep listening, to me is probably sits with the conversations we were talking about earlier in our groups around ways of noticing, and Miriam Rose talks about this idea of deep listening as a practice. So she talks about, and she's an Aboriginal activist and educator as well as an artist. And she basically talks about this idea of inner listening from an internal perspective. It's not just audible. And there's this third for learning new ways of listening, and whether it's however you describe it, some Deleuzian scholars say there's no such thing as deep listening. Foucault scholars say you've got to listen and attune your ear, and there's a practice in listening. But I think Sam Osborne talks to this further. He's talking about Anunul Pitjantjatjara Yankunytjatjara term called kulini, and it's more than just attuning the ear. It's about thinking about and considering, deciding, knowing about, understanding, remembering, feeling, having a premonition from a sense of the body. So it's bringing in like the spiritual, the environment, the soul. It's just beyond just the cognitive. So framing listening through the lens of Kulini is more than an oral process. It's corporal, and it engages the intellect and draws on experiences and memory. Listening is also a process of engaging epistemologies and cosmologies that outsider listeners may be completely unaware of. And the reason why I like using embodied strategies, even if it is standing up and making a decision, as simple as that could be online, is that we're still moving our body in a particular way and making decisions around what we're doing. And then we're noticing ourselves and noticing the collective group. And as a collective group, we pretty much did all the same. So relationality is key to this. And I think it's important, well, for me, it's important that relationality includes listening within an ethics of care. And Dardiri and Kulini offer a mode of listening that moves beyond human interaction, where connecting to place through listening informs an extended ethics of care, operating in the affective, cognitive, and aesthetic domains through practices and strategies that move us towards a relational understanding of ourselves in the world and relation to our environment, rather than at the centre of the world. So I'll conclude now, and then there'll be time for more talking. So alongside the material production practices of decolonisation is the theoretical framework by which Indigenous-led and research centralises decolonisation and shapes Indigenous settler futurity through the lens of epistemological decolonisation. Indigenous sovereign modes of negotiation, reinsertion of sovereignty and its recognition within a post-national move requires deep listening that is embodied viscerally, semiotically and effectively. There is a pedagogical turn in the curatorial and institutional space towards re-educating as a public pedagogy, reconstructing the narrative by shifting the representational field through combining semiotics that informs a new mode of public culturing that is Indigenous-led. We need to create spaces for trust as it is spoken. Reparative justice relies on trust and deep listening, and the decolonising project is exemplified by Indigenous elders' ongoing political and pedagogical agency that has carved the way by which negotiations should occur within the boundaries of respect, parity of recognition, and redistribution of land. And I know I've finished a bit early, but maybe we could chat, or anyone might want to talk about something that's relevant to their work.
Thanks, Bindi. I'm wondering if there's questions. I think there's lots of space if people have questions or anything that you want to go back to that we've spoken about maybe as well.
When you ask about in my particular kind of work, when I'm teaching, I'm an expert on my recovery from behavioral health and or substance use challenges. And therefore I could talk and teach about those aspects for me. But when I teach, I always tell people, if you disagree, please let me know, because somebody may have already tried those things and in their context, it does not work. So when I say this works, I say this works for me. And then somebody else can actually stand up and I give them the right and try and empower them to stand up and say, this does not work for me. And this is why. And I want to hear from that. I want to learn from that.
Yeah, I agree. Because in a sense, using embodied strategies certainly, you know, as a practice does not necessarily work for everybody, or let alone visual strategies.
Belinda, I was curious with your comment, if you don't mind me asking, with that Deleuzian scholars, some Deleuzian scholars would deny a deeper listening. I wondered if you could comment more about that, because it may go back to an interest of mine, which is a distinction which I mentioned before. So if you build the human being in, I use that term, build the human being in, I've sort of, it's like language literacy and numeracy in the TAFE area. There was a great report on built in, not bolted on. And it's sort of got a pragmatic sort of bluntness to it that I think epistemologically the human experience is often bolted on, not built it in modernist thinking. And so I see the ideas of like lines of flight as real in Deleuzian scholarship and rhizome as really fantastic attempts to break out of the structures of patterns of thought and so forth, but not noticing that people have thoughts, people's consciousness, that people are in bodies, and there's an epistemology of the human being that's missing. And I come to that from my background in Steiner as a Steiner education student, and then so I think one of Rudolf Steiner's tricks was to build the human being in from the start, not with the definitive account, but with a detailed account that so when these kind of indigenous knowledges talk about a deeper listening, that for me has just an immediate affinity of and noticing. The school I went to, I think what the hidden curriculum was, if you noticed something and you mentioned it, that was the greatest thing, not test results, not whatever. There was a culture of valuing noticing, because people notice things, and then you share it, and it, all of a sudden you've got a more expansive view of something. And that's captured a little bit in what you said, where you say something in a room with people, and then they ask you to repeat it, and you can't because it happened then in that note. And noticing that that's what's happening here. That kind of noticing. Anyway, I could go on for way too long, but some comment about the Deleuzian thing would be great.
Well, I'm going on a long journey in my mind with you, and I do understand that from a Steiner perspective, your epistemology is shaped from early childhood as a young person, and it rings with Bronze and her group's presentation last week, where there is that embodied listening, and the Simone Bignell is the person that sort of talks about, as a Deleuzian scholar, you know, that this notion of deep listening is not necessarily from a Western perspective, does not necessarily get into the gap between that and maybe the Collini and Darderi, or, you know, the Steiner perspective, because we're trained out of it, like you said, bolted on. So whereas I think, you know, there are other versions of listening from the the ancients and the ascetics, but still it's very cognitive. It's very stuck in a certain way of doing it, like hugging a tree you can hear. And I know that's not a great example, but there are different ways of listening. But Simone Bignell, you might want to read up on that kind of Deleuze position.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Linda, could you speak then about the Collini, and, you know, in particular the last point that was having a premonition from a sensation in the body?
Yeah, so my experience, I used to work on the APY lands as a teacher in Armata, so just in Central Desert, and there was a lot of moments where it was I would go to ceremony with the women, and we would go out to sing and dance, and so that experience shaped my learning to listen better than, and I can't say I'm like, you know, got all of that, but I'd certainly run totally by intuition now, and I think that, you know, it links to the intuitive aspect, and the more I drown in the decline of the planet and university life, the more I'm completely relying on my intuition, because there's a lot of noise out there, and I want to stick to those core values and what it is I need to hear and what's relevant. So I think we all have it. I mean, I know we all have it. So it's just whether we're tuning ourselves in or we're getting hooked up into the noise and not listening. But that runs through. And so the more you listen, the more it becomes easier to hear, I think. But I think everyone feels the same.
I think that brings you to an empathetic level where you're an empath, where you feel things and you pick up on things and a deeper sensation than others do. My brother has continually talked about when he comes into town, into the cities, he feels very uncomfortable. He cannot process. He works with children on the autism spectrum, and he has a way of connecting with people who cannot vocalize the way normal people, the way Western thinking is of what is speech, what is communicating. And he can communicate with children on the spectrum in a way. So I know he's an empath. And then when he comes in the city, there's too much noise. He cannot differentiate. He can't block it out. And
yeah,
so I was writing about my little brother, and he said that, and I was like, oh my God, he talks about that all the time.
Yeah, and we're trained out of that. So I think that, you know, in the pedagogies that are circulating around, they're very technicist and outcome focused, and it's counter narrative to the actual work that we do in public pedagogies, or at least in the Public Pedagogies Institute.
It's interesting that we're talking about deep listening now for me, because right before I jumped into this session, I was actually interviewing a Native American woman, a Navajo woman, for a documentary about the relationship between COVID-19 and sustainability. And she was talking a lot about deep listening and sort of deep listening as a way to navigate through these uncertain times and, you know, just the increased suffering and uncertainty that we're going to be in, and we already are, in the context of the Anthropocene. And she had this beautiful moment where she was like, you know, if you just sit and listen, you'll hear the birds and you might hear the wind. And she did this sound with the wind and this hand motion that was like so beautiful. And she was like, and then once you can hear it, you might start to hear the messages that are in there, that the earth is trying to bring to you. And that just, it spoke to me so much. And I feel like that's the deep listening that in Western culture, we just don't, it's not there, right? Like we're too plugged in, we're up here, we're not here in the heart space. Because I think the heart space is where that deep listening has to happen.
Yeah.
So yeah, just a comment, really interesting.
We're just now recognizing the root systems of a forest are a way of them communicating. We're just now recognizing that, is that they actually speak, and the forest knows what's going on within the forest. And we're just now recognizing this.
Yeah. I think I also was wondering whether, about the strategies that I know with Dale and Ruth, we'd done Vote With Your Seat before, and whether strategies help with deep listening or create another sort of sense embodied listening. And when we did it with Dale and Ruth, we were sort of talking more about higher education, but Dale ended up producing this, weaved her, it was your knitting, wasn't it, Dale? And so it was quite amazing to see where we got to when we just used our bodies in a different way, and whether using your body intersects at some point with that enactment of listening and choice making that comes with when you design a strategy that has a particular focus. I don't know if anyone felt that. Yeah, kinesthetic learning, yeah.
That was going to be my comment, Bindi, was with listening, and and you're talking, and I have to keep reminding myself that you're not talking about listening with your ears, which is a very Western way of listening. You know, you think about what comes in through your ears. It's not just about that. It's not just necessarily what's coming in.
Yeah.
But what's within as well. So it's another kind of disruption, I guess. And when you open up to that, what you actually can attune to with your body, and that came up in our session. I don't know if anyone noticed in our little pre-video, we used a Looney cartoon, which was about your device. And that was, I guess, a joke around the idea that we're so used to devices being our phone or a camera or whatever. But basically, your body's a device. Yeah, so it's a different way of, from a very possibly Western way of looking at it.
Yeah.
But it's great to be disrupted in that way, to sort of think about listening and deep listening in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how it happens and shifts. I don't know, even though body as device, whether anyone uses similar strategies or similar kind of methods when they're looking at from a public pedagogy perspective, like whether there's any stories about, when you are doing like the Footscray school or pop-up school, and how people actually start building a pedagogy through the bodies enacted in a public space.
We've certainly, and I think Robin will speak to this if she's here online too. Still, from that work in those pop-up schools, the place of the body and the physical space were really important in that pedagogical reading. And the movements of the bodies, of course, were I think one of the things which I'd like to sort of mention as well, because is I've been confronted today in this session by feeling a commitment to that deep listening you're talking about, than others have been discussing. But also I'm committed to noticing theory, and it's certainly something I've been working with for some time. And for me, how they are counterpoints in a way with the deep listening. And then noticing for me is such a light, there is so much lightness in noticing, especially when I see it in terms of being as opposed to observation, which is so sharp and so much linked to categorization. And all of these are about naming for me. They all come back to how we name ourselves and name the world. But noticing offers, I'm trying to put together, and I want to put together, and I think we do, both notice. We work in that lightness of noticing, and how it can be enhanced through the deep, how it is also operating alongside listening of the whole body, and how we can move through into deep listening. But I don't want to move from the lightness of noticing into that hardness of observation. Anyway, I can just think on that. I don't know if anyone's got anything to say about that, how they come together.
Seems there's a sort of a deadening once it's, well, it's the classification part of the observation.
Yes.
With the noticing, and then something shuts down once you put a boundary around it, I guess. Maybe that's the feeling. But in the noticing, you're still, you haven't yet put the boundary on it. And that's a fascinating observation, noticing that is how noticing works. I didn't have that distinction.
I unfortunately, I've coming from a history and education, I've been taught to observe, and I now resist it absolutely. I want to have a deep listening to the other and to the space, but I also want to, at the same moment, move quickly away, and which is what noticing allows, to see the whole, to see beyond. I think it was Grant, was talking about, Brian, sorry, I saw your surname, your family name at first, talked about what was the wind saying that the woman was talking to you, and it's, for them, and the noticing would allow that. If I lose focus a little and only notice.
Mary, do you think observation is more outward and noticing is more inward in terms of like a movement?
I think there is a greater interplay between the self and the other in the noticing. Yeah.
I find it like the more this tunes into the possibilities when we construct or are in spaces of public pedagogy as well. If anyone wants to link that back to the public pedagogy.
Are we skirting the ideas of Berber and I and thou? Are we skirting the ideas of Berber and I and thou? As sort of I, it universe. I, thou, you have a better connection, a bigger connection with the thou than you do with the I, it? I was asking a question.
I'm not sure. Well, I think that probably, like theoretically, we move around these ideas, but then physically, when we're actually enacting and immobilizing and engaging in public pedagogy, then we're moving more to, what Mary was sort of hinting at around those slippages. And sometimes I think we also get stuck with words, and we get, just being in that moment can actually release us from just having that moment of being in that space, being in the space, being part of it. So, but yeah, I know that we probably should sign off, but was there any other final comments or questions before we go?
I think we've got Karen coming back as well at the end.
Oh, we do. Oh, awesome.
We've got a few more minutes.
Okay, great.
I'd like to ask if I could ask another question about just the link between Joseph Beuys, and could you talk about that, Belinda?
Sure. So I found that idea of the performance and this idea of, in terms of being the educator or the teacher, and Joseph Beuys was interestingly picked up by Gert Biester, and not everybody loves Gert Biester, but I do like his work on relationality. And so he uses Beuys as an example to talk to this, this idea of how to explain, or it's that double gesture of being teacher and performing teacher. So how to explain pictures to a dead hare obviously is a metaphor of this, but Gert's been working a lifetime in education, so he's trying to kind of come up with something where there is this double gesture. So, and I think it's happening a lot in the arts where Henry, I can't remember his last name, but he's also talking about being artist as teacher, teacher as artist, and Ruth will remember. Anyway, this idea that using the double gesture as being teacher and performing teacher, I was curious about the way in which images operate in that way. And so exploring the image as operating as a circuit of culture, to me, provides opportunities for new knowledge. So that doesn't have to sit within any framework. It's not sitting within any framework. And I think we discussed that in the first session when we did the first strategy. And then how we produce new meaning, or teaching as a performance, as Kevin says, as a performance art. So often we are like, say, maybe half of us are introverts. I'm more of an introvert. And then you actually go out and you engage and you switch on your button and off you go. But so there's that side of it. But then I went from Beuys as doing the double gesture, and the way Gert Biester framed that in a particular way to talk about the Henry Ward. Thanks, Ruth. I knew you'd remember. Teaching as an artistic practice, to then going into what happens, like when I was at the Geelong Powerhouse, actually with the support of Ruth on that project, was what happens when you start circulating ideas and images, and what's happening in terms of Instagram that operates in particular ways, and what are the dangers of that, where we reproduce binaries, where we reconstruct old narratives because they haven't been understood or rethought through as a result of the semiotic fields. And that's why I went to that other strategy, which is juxtaposing those, because if we keep circulating things in a particular way, we're not decolonizing, and we're going to be, the circuit of culture is going to be still operating through privileged semiotic systems. And that's the kind of arc that I was hinting at in a very broad way.
Okay. If we haven't got any further questions. Thanks, Bindi. That's been wonderful. Really, I guess, good to be challenged and to have the opportunity to have these conversations and discussions and dialogue around really important issues that we're all thinking about and grappling with. So thanks so much. I'm going to hand over now to Karen, and thanks for everyone for your comments and discussion in the chat as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so
that was great.
I'm going to hand back to Karen and hand the hosting back to you.
Okay, thanks everyone. It does sound like it was a really fantastic session. So, and I'm glad everybody feels like it was another positive move into what I think is strong continuity between the first session you know, in this subsequent session. So a big round of applause to